Okay, so I'm recording this Zoom, and right now I'm just waiting to see if anyone else shows up. This is not actually an official meeting for the art appreciation class, but I did tell them that they could sit in if they wanted to. It would be extra credit. Um, Actually, I didn't even mention it would be extra credit. Probably should have mentioned that. And what I'm going to do pretty shortly, as soon as we get to 8:30, is I will switch it over to share screen, and I'm going to do just straight ahead the lecture. These lectures are going to be used for this class for art appreciation, but also I'm making these for the computers and art that's going on right now, and it will be a set of lectures that we can use in other classes like our design classes and in studio classes in general. So that's kind of the idea. And the content of these lectures, there are going to be three different lectures. The first one will be, what will the first one be? It's just a quick review of the art elements and the design principles. And because in my art appreciation class, I cover each of them kind of more individually, there's never a lecture where I cover them all as a set, as a group. So I thought I should do that. Then the next one is a more in-depth look at hierarchy and emphasis. Once again, in my art appreciation class, I cover hierarchy and emphasis in pieces throughout the semester, but here I'm trying to kind of put it all together, just hierarchy and emphasis all as one thing. And then the last one is on the topic of design thinking. This one is probably the least relevant to the art appreciation students, but quite very relevant for the studio students. Okay, we are very close to 8:30 my time, 7:30 Central Time, and most likely looks like no one's going to attend. So I'm just going to be talking to blank screen. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and we're going to do slideshow from the beginning. Okay, like I said, this is the first lecture, and it's going to be on the art elements and the design principles. So the components of design, the things that kind of put design together. And hopefully for many art students, um, this is kind of something you already know, but I'm going to put myself as far over to the side as possible, so I'm as least distracting. And actually, I think I can make myself. There we go. I'm not even there. Okay, I'm just a voice. So this should be pretty well known, but it's kind of a refresher to make sure that we all know. So first of all, let's talk about what are the differences between the art elements and the design principles. How do we kind of think of them as each group? The way I like to explain it is think of the art elements as the building blocks, the fundamental units of design, the things that we work with, line, shape, value, color, right? We manipulate these. And then the design principles are the way we use those. So like when we're talking about hierarchy and emphasis could be applied to line or shape, or it could be applied to line, shape, and value and all the ways they interact, right? Usually is. Okay, so the structure of this lecture, for those who are not used to my art appreciation lectures, on the first page, I always give you kind of an outline of what the whole lecture is going to be. And so as you can see, first thing we're going to do is we're going to review the art elements. So one of the things I like to say about all of the things that you learn in a design class, like the elements and design principles, but especially the art elements, which is that they're the kind of things that seem really obvious and simple when you look at them at first, but then when you start exploring what you can do with them and what they do in a composition, it gets more complicated. Like simply telling someone line is an art element in art and that almost all art uses line is kind of a well, duh kind of statement, right? That's not really not should not be a revelation to any thinking person. But learning more about lines, learning the difference between actual lines and implied lines, learning about change of line weight, learning about, you know, line characteristics other than changes in line weight, right? Learning about other kinds of line variation. learning about how lines create shapes or how lines create value contrast. These get more complicated. Okay, so the art elements are line, shape, value, color, texture, form, and space. I will be going over some of these a little bit more. Some are really just way too big for me to cover much. I'm not going to be covering color primarily because I have two lectures on color from the art appreciation class. And so if anyone wants those, they can watch those. Okay. One of the things I like to make sure everyone is aware of is that this system, like the art elements, design principles, this is not set in stone, right? This was created by human beings. It's conventional. It's been created through a process. It is in some ways what we inherited from the 19th century and then transformed into what we inherited from the early 20th century. This model, the art elements and the design principles, is very, very similar to the model of design thinking from the early 20th century from the Bauhaus. And it still works for us, but it is something that people created. So every part of this is debatable. And although this list of these seven is something that most people agree on, you could certainly make the case that there are other things that could be considered art elements. So I just want to make sure that people are aware of these things like mark, right? Because, and you could make the case that a mark is a more fundamental unit of art than either line or shape, because marks are things that can be lines and can be shapes, but can also not be either of those things. It could just be a mark. And so everything begins with that, with mark making, or almost everything. Surface can be thought of as an art element. When you're dealing with page structures, right? The edge of the page and the center of the page are fundamental elements that you are using. They're kind of hidden elements, but they're there. So these are some concepts that could be art elements, but are generally not considered. Okay. Next, the list of design principles. Once again, if you looked up the list of design principles, you would find lists of 7, lists of 5, sometimes other numbers, but usually 7 or 5. And most of them would be, you know, 90% similar to this list, 80% similar to this list, but some would be more different. There will be things that will be on some people's lists that won't be here. Like economy frequently is on some people's lists. Another thing you might see is that when you type in the design principles, some of the lists are very graphic design focused. And so they'll include things like alignment and proximity as principles. Whereas those, in terms of like when talking about the bigger sense of design beyond just graphic design to all art, um, proximity is generally thought of more as kind of like a concept related to harmony, and alignment is generally considered a concept kind of related to balance and to unity. It is actually related to a lot of things, but you could think of each of those as separate topics. But anyway, the design principles that are generally agreed upon as the 7 would be hierarchy and emphasis, balance, rhythm, repetition, and movement. Although, once again, sometimes it's just rhythm, sometimes it's rhythm and repetition, sometimes it's rhythm and movement. Repetition is left out. Everyone has like their slightly different ways of doing this. So hierarchy and emphasis, balance, rhythm, repetition, movement, harmony, unity, or sometimes people would say unity slash variety. I prefer that. Proportion, although sometimes they'll say proportion and scale or scale and proportion. And finally, contrast. Okay. But there are lots of design concepts that generally don't make that list, but certainly could. For me, the top number one is figure ground. It's always kind of amazing to me that figure ground is not on anybody's list of design principles, because to me, figure ground is one of the most fundamental design concepts. It's the way that we learn to think in design. If you don't really understand figure ground, you don't understand design thinking, as far as I'm concerned, because it means that you're not really aware of how all shape, positive and negative, is all equally active and important. You're not thinking in that kind of abstract way. All right. figure ground. But like if you look at the concept of white space, which is very, very important in graphic design, white space is strongly related to the concept of figure ground because it's about thinking of the blank as positive. Um, so all of these in this list are important. Many of them are ones that we teach in my art appreciation class. Many of them are ones that we teach in our program when we're teaching design. So they're all important ones to think about. Okay, and like I try to kind of let you know which ones seem related to other ones. All right, so for the rest of the lecture, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about line, shape, and value, and then a little bit more detail about some of the art elements, but not all of them. So with line, I'm including some examples here to show you a lot of different examples of some couple of key points, how lines create, line weight and line variation, right? So like this drawing by Rico Lebrun is a really good example of changes of line weight, changes of line variation, where also this Bryce Martin as well. Also in this, we're looking at lots of changes of different kind of use of line, like regular lines versus irregular lines, curvy, fluid lines, calligraphic lines versus tight and geometric lines. We're also looking at just, yeah, how lines work in a composition. And lastly, you're probably wondering, well, what is this painting doing there? That doesn't look like it has much in the way of lines. So one of the things also we're talking about here is the difference between actual lines, right? Like these prints and drawings are made up of actual physical lines, whereas in the Watteau, a lot of that line work is almost invisible, physical, actual lines. But the implied line, can everyone see, where's my cursor? There's my cursor. This beautiful implied curvy line of the flow of people going towards the boat, right? It's a great example of implied line. Okay, next. Shape, implied figure ground, right? Implied shapes and figure ground. So, but one thing I'm not mentioning here, I don't think, or on the next page, I probably should have, is how shapes are created, right? I talk a lot about in many of my classes, art appreciation and in my design classes about creating shape, right? And pushing yourself beyond the idea of thinking that a shape is always created by drawing a line around a shape. I try to point out that like delineation, which is drawing a line around, you know, using a line to draw around what will then become the shape of a triangle. Delineation is just one of many possible ways of making a shape. And in fact, in these paintings, we really don't see much delineation at all. What in fact we see is shapes being created by value contrast and color contrast, right? There is no line around that rectangular shape. It is simply just this shape is this color, that shape is that color. And make sure to remember that this is a shape. So we're also talking about figure ground. Clearly, well, actually all of these, but especially these three are really kind of playing with what is positive and what is negative, and really getting you to think about the negative space shapes as being kind of very active, positive elements in the composition. Okay. So value contrast and ways of creating value contrast. I go into a good deal about like the ways of creating value contrast and also understanding in my art appreciation class, I talk a lot about the difference between, like, there really are two components to value contrast. One is the difference between the lightest light and the darkest dark in a composition, right? Like, this is a really good example, okay? So in this ink wash here, and in this photograph by Sugimoto, right? The actual contrast, like the difference from the absolute lightest light in this composition and the absolute darkest dark in this composition is actually greater. Like the difference between them is greater than the contrast here. But this image feels more contrasty because we have places where we have darkest dark right up against pretty light lights, right? Whereas here, the shift of value is slow, so slow and gradual that it doesn't feel as high contrast. So value contrast is really made up of two components, right? It's made up of the degree, the range, right? The difference from the lightest light to the darkest dark, but it's also made up of the speed of contrast. How quickly does the value change from one area to another? And so one of the things about Baroque painting, not all Baroque painting, but especially the Baroque painting that we tend to call tenebrism, right? Such as like this painting. Where's my cursor again? There it is. Whoop, there it is. This painting by Gentileschi, and then like this painting by Caravaggio, that they both have these two qualities, which is they have a pretty extreme range of value going from the lightest light to the darkest dark, but they also have a very fast speed of contrast where it goes from the lightest light to the darkest dark very quickly. Okay, so let's talk about some design principles. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on hierarchy and emphasis because I'm doing a whole separate lecture on hierarchy and emphasis, but I have some examples. Pallav is a great example of hierarchical use of scale. I like to talk about these two images, this drawing by Sheldon Tapley, an artist that I actually do know, and a great pastel artist, and this painting by Willem de Kooning, an artist I never met. He's a genius. And one of the things I like about them is that they're both about kind of pushing the boundaries of how much information we can give to the human eye and still keep things hierarchical. And whereas the Jacques-Louis David painting is much more clearly hierarchical, right? We have a clear sense of what is the most important moment in it. Balance. I think balance is pretty clear. I'm also not going into too much detail on balance because I have a whole separate lecture on balance. But in each of these examples, they are all either perfectly symmetrical or near symmetrical, or kind of like this painting, kind of like a play on symmetry. Um, the uh, the rose window from Notre Dame is an example of radial symmetry, and being radial symmetry, that means it is also an example of rotational symmetry. In my lecture on balance, I talk about the difference between rotational symmetry and radial symmetry, as well as the difference between those versus axial symmetry. Okay. Rhythm and movement. So I want to go into a little bit more detail about rhythm and movement. And so I'm using a number of examples to show you a number of different kind of ways of creating rhythm and movement. A lot of these use repetition as a way of kind of moving our eye, repetition of colors, repetition of shapes as a way of moving our eye. But also keep in mind that shapes themselves, right, the way shapes are organized. I mean, just think about the amount of movement in the way Henri Matisse wrote the word jazz, right? And the kind of movement that's created from that, or the sort of movement that's created by this kind of organization. So there's movement here created by repetition, the shapes of the stairs and the shapes of these bars and the negative space between the bars creates repetition and movement, but also the big arc there also creates movement. And then we have like qualities about the blur and the distortion caused by the bicycle being slightly distorted in the frame, so the shapes of those ellipses are kind of bent. All of that combined creates movement. Okay, and keep in mind that rhythm is can sometimes be about movement, like really active movement that kind of see. Once again, where's my cursor in a photograph like this, or in this piece? But it can also be much slower, just almost like a good example would be this, where it's more just about a dance. It's not about flying from one place to another. It's about this kind of dance going on the surface. Harmony. Okay. Um, Harmony is a big topic, and we have to really kind of understand consonants and dissonance to really kind of understand harmony. But I'll give you my kind of basic definition of harmony here, which is that we can think of harmony as being about being kind of trying to find a balance between the contrast of things versus the unity of things, right? That whether it's the colors that you use, the shapes that you use, that you're or any number of things that you're looking for ways to make everything feel like it goes together, feels unified, without being so unified that we lose distinctions and contrast. And so by making choices of like how these colors relate to these colors, right? And how they relate to these colors, that they're similar, but that they also have clear, distinct differences, right? With every choice that you're trying to think about, how is this kind of similar to that, but how is this also making a clear, distinct choice or difference from that? That's one of the main ways that we create harmony. Unity and unity versus variety. These are all really good examples of unity, and unity can be almost monotonous, right? Like in the case of Sujimoto, but I think for what makes that piece so intense is it's like it's almost too much unity, and yet at the same time, because when you really start staring at it, and especially when you start seeing where is my cursor? Start seeing the all the detail of the waves, the little tiny ripple waves that are right up close to us. It just kind of like it's just enough contrast to hold the whole thing together. Okay. Proportion. And I think the Sistine Chapel is a really good example of use of proportion, both in each of the figure drawings. It's an amazing masterclass in human proportion, but more importantly, proportion in design, the way he thought about the design problem of how to paint the ceiling, how to deal with the technical problems of how to paint a large fresco painting without having seams show, because you can't paint it all at one time. You have to put down plaster and then another section of plaster. So um, so proportion is all about, and it's kind of related to what we were talking about with harmony, which is that proportion is also about having the right amount of difference from the other thing. Okay. And lastly, contrast. We were already talking about value contrast a little bit. Contrast can be more than value contrast. It could be color contrast. It could be contrast of scale, contrast of places where you have lots of mark making versus places that you don't. Places where things are really, really kind of controlled versus places where things are much looser. Um, and, but yes, contrast is very critical, because in the end, that is the way that our eyes see distinctions. Okay, and I think that might be the end. So that is the end of the lecture of part one. And then in a moment, I will get to part two. All right, I'm going to stop the share at this point, and it doesn't look like anyone tried to attend, which is fine. All right, I will see everyone in lecture part two.